Good morning. This is Miss Hadi from Olympian High School, and today I want to go over the AP World History rubric for the 2021 exam. As far as I know, the rubric has reverted back to the 2019 rubric. So in 2020, there was a weird rubric that they used because of the pandemic, and so that was different than normal, but I haven't seen anything that says that it's going to be different this year. So plan on going, when you Google the rubrics, you have AP World History, exam rubrics for writing, and plan to use the 2019, the 2019 one, the one that's included in the course exam description, the CED. So I'm going to be going over things, and as I'm going over things, you should be taking notes. You should think about, what is this point? How do I get this point? Where do I put it in my essay? Those are the two main things I want you to think about, and what doesn't count. So we'll start by looking at what the College Board has released. So the first thing to know is that the people who grade your exam are college professors and teachers, and they're really smart. They're also human. So sometimes it's in your best interest to make it as obvious as possible when you are trying to get a certain point. It's a little bit tacky sometimes. You don't want to be too blatant. Sometimes students will put like thesis after they write their thesis in order to try to get that point. And a qualified reader won't just give you a point because you called it a thesis. It still has to meet the requirements. But try not to be too subtle, I guess is what I'm saying. So for all of these things, remember that there are humans that are grading this. So you want to try to use good writing and try to make it obvious what you're doing. Be explicit in your writing, which is not always the case for all students. Some students are more subtle. Okay, so the first thing we're going to look at is that they're telling you that each point of the rubric is earned independently. So you don't have to worry that if you, for example, don't get the early points, that you won't get the later points, which used to be an issue in previous exams. So it's possible to get all of the points independently of the others. Although some of the points, you could take the totality of the essay to get points. I'll explain when we get to that part. Okay, so each point is earned independently. You have to be accurate. However, the people who are grading your exam are trained to overlook errors. So in a way, if you're not saying you should do this, but if you're not sure if something is correct, if you write it in your essay and the other parts are correct and it's wrong, they're trained to overlook that and look at what you wrote that is correct. So it's better to try and be wrong in the evidence that you use than to not try at all. So if you're not sure, include the evidence. Again, this is not like the best type of writing style. This is trying to get points for the exam. It's a little bit of a game. Okay, so, oh, it does say as long as the historical content used to advance the argument is accurate, it's okay if you have some errors. Okay, clarity. So these exams are considered to be first drafts and might contain grammatical errors. Basically, they're not going to count it against you if you have a couple of small errors. Yeah, they're going to overlook that and focus on the important things. So finally, let's get to the rubric for the DBQ, the document-based question. Depending on if you're taking the paper, the digital exam, you might also have an LEQ, a long essay question, which has a similar rubric. So first, we all need to remember that the DBQ has changed over the years. So when this class was first given, you sometimes had 10 documents that you had to look at in 10 minutes. And now you have a full hour. They limit the number of documents you get to 7, and that's really wonderful. So you have 15 minutes to read and then 45 minutes to write. I always tell my students, plan on doing about 7 to 8 minutes a paragraph. And if you think about it that way and you're writing a sentence a minute, it's not so bad, especially with planning. So you give yourself some space to go back and look at things. So try to think about pacing when you're writing as well, and that will come with practice and time. So this is 7 points, but that 7 points is part of an overall larger sort of plan for how they're going to give you points and how they're going to score your essay. So, okay, so don't worry so much about the 7 points, but you do want to get all these 7 points or as many of these points as you can, but that number will be transformed as they do your grading to figure out if you get a 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 on the overall exam. So the first point you want to get is called the thesis. English teachers like to call it a claim. It's the same thing. It's the argument you're going to make. It has to respond to the prompt, so you have to know what the prompt is. That means you have to determine what historical thinking skill is it mainly asking for. Sometimes it's asking for more than one. So the three major things that they typically ask for are cause and effect, change in continuity, compare contrast, or parts of that. But they don't always ask that, or sometimes they ask combinations of that. Like, tell us about the similarities and differences between Africa and Asia in the effects of imperialism. So at that point, you have to compare and contrast and do compare and contrast of effects. You have to determine the effects and then see if they're similar or different. So whatever they ask you, you have to answer that. So if they say jump, you say how high. If they ask you for butterflies and unicorns, you have to do butterflies and unicorns. I say that because in the past, some teachers taught their students like a formula, like, oh, just do 3 parts Persian. Persian are categories that stand for things like political, economic, religious, social, all that. So it's not that. For example, an inspect chart is what we use in my class. It's not like, oh, just put in 3 broad categories. No. But if you get stuck and you can figure out what the question is asking, the first step I would go is to think about the categories. So if they ask you, for example, for the effects of imperialism, you can ask yourself, okay, well, what are the social effects of imperialism? What are the economic effects of imperialism? So you can use that as a place to brainstorm. So when you create your prompt, I would say circle, underline, highlight, what is the skill? Ask yourself, what is the skill they're asking? If I could give one piece of advice to all students that would help them in essay writing, it's to answer the damn question. Answer the question. So make sure you know what the question is. Don't just restate the prompt or rephrase it. That's what this is saying. And the other problem is in the past, the way they graded the thesis depended on a lot of factors, but they used to grade it differently. So some years it wouldn't count if it was more than one sentence or it didn't have a time and a place. For now, for the last few years, the College Board has said it must be in the introduction or in the conclusion. So your best bet is to put it in both places. Yeah, so if we draw a simple 5-paragraph essay with that upside down triangle being the intro and then these boxes being body paragraphs, you want your thesis in a normal essay to be at the end of the first paragraph and the beginning of the last paragraph. But that's not what I would advise on a DBQ. So if we make the thesis a star, I would say start with your thesis. You could put it technically anywhere in this first body paragraph, but I would say start with your thesis and then do what's called a grouping sentence. That used to be something you got points for. You don't get points for that anymore, but it does help you organize your essay. And by a grouping sentence, I mean take all the documents that you get, think about how they relate to your thesis. So if your thesis has 2 parts or 3 parts or 1 part, hopefully it has more than 1 part, let's say you're going to do 2 effects or 3 effects. You could say, well, documents 1, 2, and 3 show effect number 1. And documents 3, 4, and 5, or whatever, 4, 5, and 6 show the second effect. Okay, so basically you would have your thesis, that's the star, and then your grouping sentences. And maybe you want to do historical context as well. So we'll put thesis, grouping sentences, historical context, and I'll explain what that is. So that's where it's going to go. So I've talked about what the thesis is. It's an argument that you're going to make throughout the essay. And then I've told you where it goes. It's going to go in the introduction and in the conclusion. That's where it has to go to get credit. I would put it in both places. Now, your thesis, it could have 2 parts, it could have 3 parts. Now, because you have 1, 2, 3 body paragraphs, maybe you have a 4th body paragraph if you have a complicated thesis, I would say put each part of your thesis in a paragraph and make topic sentences that relate to the thesis. So let's say your thesis is, I don't know, let's make it really simple, which you would never do this because this is too simplistic. But let's say you said something like there were negative and positive economic effects of imperialism. Okay, so something as simple as that. So maybe here you'd say, these are all the negative effects, and then here you'd say, oh, these are all the positive effects. That is too simplistic of a thesis. But just to give you a sense of how you could organize, if your thesis was 2 parts, put the first part in paragraph 1, and the second part in paragraph 2. So organize it that way. There's lots of ways to do organization. There's no rule. You should learn the rules of writing and then break them. That's the fun part. But just try to stay organized. Okay, so now we know what a thesis is and where it goes. Let's move on to the next point, which is contextualization. Historical context, sometimes I put HX on your essays, or HC. So this is when you think about, like, if there was somebody in a picture and they're like, ah, to find out why they were doing that, you would zoom out, and that's the context. Sometimes the context is the reason for why something's happening, and sometimes it's not the reason. It's just something that's happening at the same time. Okay, so basically I'm saying it's not necessarily a cause of what's happening. So context is when you zoom out, what are the larger things that are taking place or transpiring at that time? So for example, if somebody dies in the war, you could say, well, that's because it was in the middle of World War II. And that's what was going on at the time. It helps to frame or contextualize what's happening. When you're thinking of context, think of large things that are usually transpiring in more than one state. Okay, they can be social things, economic things, religious things. It can be things spreading, diffusing, like a pandemic. And let's see what it says here. So these are events that or developments or processes that occur before, during, or continue after. So this is the cool part. They're giving you a lot of flexibility. So let's say you're doing some essay, and you've got all these documents that are about World War I, but you know that after World War I, you have the Great Depression, all these other tensions, the rise of different new ideologies. You could talk about that, relate it to World War I, and get credit. Where now? So I've talked about what it is, or if you're talking about World War II, you could say, Cold War is coming, and this is how, you can connect those two pieces of information, and you could get credit. So it doesn't have to be from the same time period, but most students choose to do that because it's just easier to say what's happening at that time. But just so you know, you have options. You could do before, during, or after. You don't get this point for just saying World War I was going on at the same time, or there was a Great Depression. You have to try to connect it to what's going on in your essay. Okay? Try to connect it to what's going on in your essay. Now the question is, where does it go? I would put it everywhere you can. So here I put HC, but I'm actually going to change it to HX because I like that better. If I was writing this and I was a student, I would put a little historical context in the intro, and then I would try to see if I could put it in every single paragraph. This isn't going to always happen. Like sometimes you'll have documents, like let's say this paragraph is about an economic effect, yeah? And you have 3 documents that prove that there was an economic effect. So you're like, this economic effect can be seen in documents 1, 2, and 3. And one of the documents, like you could see a reference to the Great Depression. Then you can talk at length about the Great Depression and how it's affecting what's going on at that time. Now there is like a mini historical context that you can do that's related to sourcing, and that's not what I'm talking about now. That's a separate thing that you do to source a document. So just want to be clear about what this is not. This contextualization is larger. It's not just about one document, although you could do sort of the context of a particular document. This is about what's going on in general that affects the topic of the essay. Okay, so we've got 2 points down. Let's move on to evidence. You must use evidence from the document. Now, there's 2 different ways of thinking about evidence. One is to use it to talk about the evidence correctly, and the other is to support an argument. So to get 1 point, you use the context from at least 3 documents to address the topic of the prompt. So when it says uses, it means you're showing that you understand that document. So for example, you don't get messed up from things like sarcasm. A lot of kids get tripped up on sarcasm. Or you don't just trust whatever the document is saying. You think critically about if this document is, and that's related to sourcing and things like that. But like you understand the document. For example, if it says that economic productivity is declining, you don't say, oh, it's increasing. You understand it well, and you cite the documents. Make sure you're putting document 1 or document 2 or document 3 in parentheses when you're talking about evidence from that document. That's the easiest way to do it, rather than trying to write out exactly who wrote it and talk about it in a lengthy way, because the people that are grading your essay are also tired, and it's just easier for them. So you want to make it as easy as possible for the people grading your essay to realize which documents you're using and give you points. Now, when you support an argument, not only do you say evidence from the document, and you don't want to paraphrase long quotes, or you don't want to put long quotes, you want to paraphrase, maybe use tiny bits of quotes. So you take evidence and then you say what it shows, what it proves, what it illustrates, what it demonstrates, and always connect it back to your topic sentence. And since your topic sentence or that paragraph is a small part of the thesis, you're always proving your thesis. And to get those 2 points, you have to do it for 6 documents. Okay, so it says that you must describe, not simply quote, rather than simply quote, the content of at least 3 documents for the first point. To get 2 points, then you have to do it for 6 documents and then use it to support an argument. So once you have the evidence, explain how it proves your point. Just take an extra sentence or two. And I know it seems obvious. To you, it might be like, oh, well, it's obvious. Like, this is what's happening. No, you have to explain. Therefore, this shows, or this demonstrates, or this reveals, and then explain. Then there's another point in the evidence category, which is evidence beyond the documents. Basically, it's something you know that's from your textbook or from class or from whatever research you've done, your prep book, something that you know that also proves the point in that paragraph. So at least one additional piece of specific historical evidence relevant to the argument about the prompt. And it can't be something that's already in the document. So for example, the document says, like, women were really hurt by this particular thing, and you go on and say, well, I have this evidence that shows that women were really hurt, and they'd say, well, yeah, we already know that from a different document. So you have to add something new. Don't worry here. Remember that they're going to overlook if you make mistakes. So try to include evidence that you remember. And sometimes you think it needs to be more specific than it is. I've seen students get points for this for pretty simple evidence that they include. So just see what you can add. So again, if the paragraph is about chocolate and you know about another kind of chocolate, add that information about chocolate that's beyond the documents. Whatever that paragraph's about, if it's about economics, what other economic information do you have that would contribute to your argument? So this says the response must describe the evidence and must use more than a phrase or a reference. You have to explain it. This additional piece of evidence must be different from the evidence used to earn the point for contextualization. Okay, so you can't double dip, what's called. It has to be separate. And then the last part is analysis and reasoning. There's 2 different points, and I've graded this before, and they will give you the point if you get it, whether you don't have to get both to get the points, so you get it separately. So analysis and reasoning. For at least 3 documents, you have to do what's called sourcing. So most teachers these days teach this using like some kind of acronym. So in the past, I've used the acronym FIA. These days, I use the acronym HAPPY. This is when you think about how different things might influence what that document is saying. The first thing is the H, and here it's the historical situation or context. So if someone is talking about feeling hurt and getting injured, and you're like, oh, well, it's because this person survived the war, then say that that affects why this person is saying this. Okay, so that's the first part is H, happy, or if you're doing FIA, it's the PH, the H part. A is author's point of view, and here you can see the document's point of view. Sometimes you don't always know the author, but usually you can check the source line, and I'm going to tell you a secret here. This is probably the easiest way to do sourcing. You can think about the person's gender, their class, that means if they're rich, if they're poor, their education, their knowledge, all of those things influence what they're saying. Sometimes you can say that someone is more reliable rather than saying that they're not credible. Often kids will just go quickly to, this person is biased or not biased. Try to avoid that. Try to instead explain why the person is saying what they're saying based on who they are, their gender, their religion, their politics, all of those things. If you can just explain why someone is saying something in a certain way, you've done sourcing. Okay, so sourcing is like it's analysis, but it's analyzing why the document is saying what it's saying. The P is purpose, and often you can do these together. You can say, well, because this person is a communist, they're trying to gain more followers or to get more people to support the communist cause, or because this person is a politician, they're trying to get more votes, which is why they're kissing up to a particular group of people. So sometimes you can use these together, purpose. So that's the P. And then we have one more, and that's audience. Audience, oh shoot, I messed up. This is intended audience. Yeah, no, this is right. So intended audience, the I is not always as intuitive, but intended audience is, who is this for? If this is for someone who's like a close confidant, sometimes people will be more honest. Yeah, so if, the Meghan Markle interview just came out about her feeling like the royal family isn't as supportive and feeling like the, media, that she's experienced racism and all that. If she was writing that to a close confidant, we could expect that she's probably being more honest than if she was, writing to someone. If it was like an official document, for example, oftentimes official documents hide things that are negative or minimize things that are negative. This is just a quick example off the top of my head. So think about who the audience is and how that might affect what's being said. So this is about explaining how or why the document's happy, historical situation, purpose, author's point of view, audience is relevant to an argument about the prompt for each of the three sources. So then your question is going to be, well, where do I do this? I would say do it at least once in every body paragraph. If you do it once in every body paragraph and there's at least 3 body paragraphs, you're done. Or do it more than once, just in case one of your one of your examples of sourcing is wrong. So I would do that. And what some students do is they'll add an additional paragraph, like they're all done, and maybe they'll leave some space, and they'll go back, they'll do more sourcing on documents. The last point is the hardest point to get. I hardly see anybody get this point. Okay, this is like really showing strong historical reasoning and analytical skills. Demonstrates a complex understanding. You have to show that you really understand the history around whatever question they asked you. Demonstrates a complex understanding of the historical development that is the focus of the prompt, using evidence to corroborate, qualify, or modify an argument that addresses the question. So let's talk about these words. You would think that if you organized your essay in a way where the different documents are grouped and that you have an organization, then you're corroborating the evidence. So, for example, if you're taking evidence from document 1 and connecting it to evidence from document 2, the evidence is, and you're using it to prove the point, you're corroborating the evidence together. Maybe you even couple it with a kind of evidence from outside. So you're putting the evidence together to support an argument. That's the easiest thing to do, as long as in totality, you're arguing really well. So that's corroborating. To qualify or modify, when we qualify something, we talk about, or modify it, we talk about exceptions. So for example, let's say the bulk of your essay is saying, and I'm going to make it a simple argument again that you would never do, something like, I don't know, something like World War II had negative effects on, I don't know, society. Let's just say there were a lot of deaths, blah, blah, blah. There were all these negative effects. Let's say that that's your argument. Again, that's too simplistic. But then you think of something that's an exception to what you just said, like a situation in which it was positive. Then at the end of a particular paragraph, you could talk about sort of the counter argument, or you modify or it's called change your argument, you qualify it. You're like, oh, it was negative, except in this situation. Or let's say you're saying that, World War I led to a rise in nationalism, but you know about a particular instance where it dampened nationalist sentiment. Then you want to address that, and then you're qualifying or modifying an argument. Now your question is going to be, well, where do you do this? How do I do this? You do it throughout the essay. So when someone awards you a point for this, they're not looking at a particular sentence. Sometimes it's the totality of your essay that they're like, wow, this person really looked at a lot of different things. So if you're corroborating evidence, you might be looking at multiple, you have like a nice argument. So it's throughout the essay, or it could be that you demonstrate a deep understanding in one small paragraph where you talk about an exception. You've modified or qualified your argument. So here are all the ways that you could get this point that most people never get. You could explain the nuance, some small detail that most people miss. You're like, oh, most people will just see the negatives and they miss this positive thing. Or most people just see how things were different, but they miss the similarity. So you're showing some small detail that reflects that you've really analyzed a lot of variables. Or you do something fully. So if the question is a compare-contrast question, not only do you look at similarities, you also look at differences, and multiple similarities, multiple differences. If it's a change in continuity question, you're looking at continuities and changes. So rather than just focusing on like one small thing, you're looking at multiple variables, multiple things. It all depends on the question though. If it's a cause and effect question, you're doing multiple causes, multiple effects. So this is arguing really well and corroborating your evidence. This is often not done. This also shows a deep historical complex understanding. If you can make a connection within and across time periods. So for example, if something about World War I reminds you about a war from, I don't know, ancient Greece, that's a connection across time periods. And as long as you can explain like how, in what way they're similar, that's really cool. And someone would be impressed by your historical knowledge, okay? Confirming the validity of an argument by corroborating multiple perspectives across themes. I hardly ever see anybody do this. So there's the different historical themes of the class, that are represented through the inspect chart that I've talked to you about, interactions between humans and the environment, S, social, political, economic. This one's going to be hard. I'm going to refrain from teaching this. You guys are welcome to look for it through their examples. but it's pretty hard to do, so we want to avoid this one. And then the last one I did teach you, this is about qualifying or modifying an argument by thinking about diverse or alternative views or evidence. So let's say all of your evidence proves that the effects of a war were negative, but you have some evidence that shows that it was positive in a certain circumstance, then that would be a qualification or a modification of an argument. All of this must be not just a mere reference, but you have to do it, basically over-explain. So you don't need to explain for like paragraphs and paragraphs, but think I need to explain at least 2 sentences worth to get this point. And again, for this last point, it's very hard to get. Very few students get it, but you're going to do your best. You're going to do your best by having an organized essay. That's like step 1, and thinking about answering the question fully, and then maybe consider if there's a qualification or modification or a connection you can make. But if the rest of your points, you're getting them, even if you don't get that particular point, you'll probably do fairly well on the AP exam. So at a minimum, you should absolutely try to get a thesis point. So definitely put your thesis in the intro and the conclusion. Absolutely try to get a context point. So do that throughout, wherever it makes sense, okay? Especially, try to do it once a paragraph. Evidence, you want to use all of the evidence, and then you want to bring in evidence from beyond the document. And when you use the evidence, don't just say what the evidence says. Talk about how it proves your point to get that the supports an argument part of the points. And then we've talked about sourcing, so get really comfortable sourcing documents using Happy or FIA to source documents, and maybe devote an entire paragraph to sourcing. And then just do your best with this last one. I hope you found that helpful.